Weston Testo will tell us about the rise of the Andes promoting rapid diversification and Neotropical Phlegmariurus.
Beautiful pronunciation. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm going to be talking today about some of the work I did for my dissertation on diversification of a hard to pronounce and very interesting group of club mosses from essentially South America. So I think a lot of people in here are already familiar with the kind of well-established story at this point of the Andes as an exceptional biodiversity hotspot, right? So this is Earth's richest terrestrial biodiversity hotspot. At least 45,000 vascular plant species there. Nearly half of those are found nowhere else on Earth, right? And it's home to a series of exceptionally rapid radiations, as has been demonstrated, for example, in lupins. Really nice work in the Campanulaceae. Laura Lago Marcino did beautiful work on that. You've seen stuff in Puglia, Rubiaceae, as well as a bunch of animal groups. Very little has been done, in contrast, in the spore-dispersed vascular plants, the ferns and the lycophytes. But if we think about why the Andes are such an exceptionally diverse place on Earth, a lot of people point out that the mountains' recent and rapid rise probably has a lot to do with that, right? These are very new ecosystems. Lineages have recently entered those and haven't had time to go extinct yet. There's also a really important factor of adjacency to other hotspots, right? We're near Central America, we're near the Caribbean, we're near Amazonia, all of which are quite diverse in their own right, and there's a lot of interchange between those regions. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on with topographical complexity in the Andes, right? We have some of the steepest elevational gradients on Earth, so very high mountain peaks are cut by very deep inter-Andean valleys. And the tops of many of these mountains, right, we're talking an average elevation in the northern Andes of like 4,000 meters. It's the average elevation. You have these high mountain peaks that are functioning essentially as islands in the sky, right? They're surrounded by seas of middle and low elevation rainforests. And since the Pleistocene and Pliocene, we've seen a lot of fluctuations in temperature and corresponding glaciation and zonation of habitats moving up and down these mountains by really remarkable extents. So that's had important impacts on habitat availability and connectivity of populations on these mountain tops. So the group that I was studying is Phlegmariurus. It is the largest genus in the Lycopodiaceae. So again, we're down here. We are in the lycophytes, so sister to the ferns and the seed plants. About 150 species in an essentially monophyletic group in the American tropics. And this is most diverse in the Andes, right? So you go to, say, Costa Rica, for example, you'll see 30 species. You go to Colombia, there's about 80 or 90, and the same in Ecuador. It's principally a montane group. There's some low elevation taxa, but there are a lot of species that grow in montane forests and even more that grow in the paramos, in the alpine grasslands of the Andes. And I think it's a compelling study group because there's evidence of an apparent rapid radiation. This is an old genus in almost all of its extant diversity appears to have been accumulated within the past few million years. So it's really interesting in that. And that appears to correspond to a recent transition from epiphytic to terrestrial growth. The group's ecologically diverse. And I think it's really cool because they're spore-dispersed plants, right? We have a growing body of literature that's really compelling about angiosperms. There's essentially nothing known about spore-dispersed plants and their radiation in the Andes. And people might suggest that if these things are blowing around, their spores are in the wind, oh, ferns can go anywhere, lycophytes can go anywhere, these mountains don't matter. I think that's wrong. So, these are the plants. I hope you can see why I like them. I think they're really beautiful things, quite diverse. You have terrestrial plants down the bottom, for example. Those are the things you find in the paramos at high elevations. You find a bunch of epiphytes. Buddy Michael Sundu has a really pretty one up there. That's from Mexico, I think. Really cool group, really diverse. And the diversity in the American tropics basically breaks down into two very different groups. One of them is a group of epiphytic species. These form a grade in the phylogeny, but about 70 taxa. They are found principally in montane forests, so 0 to 3,000 meters elevation, most diverse around 1,500. Most of these species are morphologically and genetically appear to be quite well differentiated, and many of them have broad ranges. In contrast, we have a very young and diverse group of terrestrial species that are restricted to paramos. So about the same number of species. These are found above 3,000 meters. Many of these species seem to be weakly differentiated, right? They're probably very young species, and many of them have small ranges. Lots of narrow endemics here to single mountaintops. So two contrasting patterns there. This is not advancing, there we go. So the principal question again is, did the rise of the Andes drive diversification in Neotropical Phlegmariurus? So to do this, I used a time-calibrated phylogeny from a recent paper, tested for a correlation between Andean paleo elevation based on geological estimates of the height of the Andes at different times, and lineage diversification rates, which were calculated in BAM. Did those associations in the package R-Panda. I think that's a really powerful and interesting package that people should check out. Use phylogenetic independent contrast to look at associations between net diversification rates and a series of kind of trait and species attributes. So the mean elevation that a taxon is found at its elevational range, so its lowest elevation minus its highest elevation where you find it, its geographic range to tease out these narrow endemics versus broadly distributed taxa, and also niche breadth, which was calculated from World Plume dataset stuff. And just real quick, here's the time-calibrated phylogeny. Basically, what I want to point out here is that this Crassus group. These are the Paramo terrestrial taxa. So this clade is about 45 million years old of all the neotropical taxa. Most of these are epiphytes up here. Here's your terrestrial taxa, and they have been diversifying quite recently. Have about 70% of the clade samples here. And just to kind of parse out the diversity a little bit here, this graph has net diversification rate for each of these clades depicted and corresponding to mean elevation. The size of the circles is the number of taxa in these species groups. So the thing that really stands out, I think, is that you have a very large clade that is rapidly diversifying at high elevation, right? And that's these terrestrial taxa. Looking at the diversification of the group, a lot going on here, but I'll just point out a few things real quick. Again, we have the chronogram back here, and there's a series of lines. I'll walk through those quickly. The green dotted line is our best fit line for the paleo elevation of the Andes, right? So based on geological estimates, what's the line that we get? It's pretty much here. We start to break above around the 3,000 meter mark, looking back about 8 million years ago. So the alpine zones developed after that. Most estimates have that being around 5 million years ago or so. And then I just got a couple of lineage through time plots just to kind of guide us through here. The red and blue ones are simulated data from birth-death trees and the Yule tree process. So that's kind of how fast you expect lineage diversity to accumulate in this group with a constant rate of diversification. What we actually see in yellow, the real pattern, is that there's a lag early in the diversification history of this group, and then an uptick more recently. That's just kind of pointing to this on the board, but we see this uptick right around here when this crosses over into above tree line. To look at it a little more carefully and look at these correlations between paleo elevation and lineage diversification, really getting at, is there which sort of model best explains the diversification history of this group? All of the best fit models that we have an association, a positive association between net diversification rates in this group and the elevation of the Andes. So basically, as the Andes grew, this group diversified more rapidly. So yes, an increase in the elevation of the Andes is correlated with increased speciation rates in this group. Looking at a few phylogenetic independent contrasts here. Real quick, the dots are species. These are tip rates. So on the y-axis, you have net diversification rate, right, going from slow diversifying things down here to high up here. And then each box is dealing with these four traits that I mentioned. The two that I want to really point out with the red boxes around them are species range and mean elevation. So the pattern that we see is that there's a negative association between net diversification rates in this group and the size of the species range. So the fastest diversifying taxa have small ranges. The slowest diversifying ones are these widespread, typically low elevation groups. And we see that down here, that there is a positive, strong positive association between the mean elevation that you find taxon at and its diversification rate. So the fastest diversifying things have small ranges and they're at high elevations. So yes, the rise of the Andes did drive diversification in this group. Uplift of the Andes seems to be strongly correlated with increased diversification rates. And I think the model here fits quite well with what we've seen from other groups, right? So that we have speciation that's occurring on isolated mountaintops, and that's really what's contributing principally to the diversity of this group. And this pattern is largely driven by paramo taxa. So it's these plants that are driving this in these habitats. So I think it fits perfectly well in the kind of profile of these typical rapid radiations that we've heard from many animals and angiosperms. Geographic speciation in these sky islands. I think that there's a lot going on that we need to tease out with climate-related shifts in range connectivity between these mountaintops. So populations that are now isolated from each other appear to probably have been in contact and out of contact with each other, corresponding to glacial cycles. I think the whole thing's probably more complex than we yet know. There appears to be hybrids here, and there are, I promise you, a lot of cryptic and undescribed species in this group. And I think this is important because it really is the first documented Andean radiation in spore dispersed vascular plants, right? So I think it shows that these taxa appear to follow the same pattern that we see for other groups, despite having a somewhat higher dispersal capacity. I think it hopefully helps to dispel this notion that ferns and lycophytes, with their small wind-blown spores, just get everywhere in the world and have no geographic signal. I don't think that's the case. A lot of people think that. So with that, that's it. Thank you all very much. I'd like to thank all these people and people and institutions that made this work possible. And if there's any questions, I'd be glad to take them at this time.
We have 2 minutes anyways, but since it's the break now.
Yes, Tom.
Sure, great talk, very interesting results. What I find most interesting is this negative relationship in diversification rate to species range, which could arise either through limited dispersal or through perhaps a connection to time. In other words, that the most recently derived species are still spreading.
Yes.
Or through an artifact, namely a relationship between elevation, which you saw as a powerful correlate,
Yes.
and range size. In other words, the higher the mountain you are,
I think it's probably all of those, but I think the last point that you bring up is actually a really key thing that's kind of constraining both the ranges and the ability of these things to speciate. Very much that, yes, you have more connectivity of habitats at lower elevations, so things can have these very broad ranges. And at high elevations, they would have to make that jump to the same, and they're not doing it, it seems like.
So, in that, have you done a multiple regression yet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Carl.
It's kind of a follow-up question. I was toying with the idea that you've got limited geographic range as you go up to the top of a mountaintop.
Yep.
You have plants that are terrestrial, but the wind profiles, the roughness factors, and then you have epiphytes growing in forested communities
Yes.
with large geographic ranges,
Yes.
but then you have a lot of places to catch the spores,
Exactly.
maybe low wind speed profiles. So there's a lot of trade-offs going on.
absolutely. I think they're totally different plants. If you look at how they behave, they're totally different. And yes, I think it's hard to get those forests to land in quite the right habitats when you're sitting way up on the top of these mountains, and you have, I think it really does function essentially as island biogeography, right?
Yeah.
That they're trying to land on another island, and if they land in the forest below them, they're gonna.
Have you done any kind of garden transplant kind of?
I have not. These are really difficult things to
Yeah.
work with, actually.
Yeah.
But it would be really interesting and exciting to do something. So,
Yeah.
for sure.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Maybe just
Can I-
One more.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
kinda cutting them.
Thank you. Great talk. You mentioned about connectivity of
Yes.
this area with Amazon and things like that.
Yes.
I wonder if you actually seen multiple kind of origin connections from the phylogeny with tropical and other kind of.
Yeah. So the things across the American tropics form a monophyletic group. There are some things that have dispersed from the Americas to Africa, but among those regions, the Andes and Amazonia and Central America, for example, there are many taxa that switch back and forth between those and appear to be widespread in those. They're almost all the forest-dwelling taxa, but we do see some of the terrestrial alpine taxa making it into like the paramos of Costa Rica or alpine habitats in Mexico and Guatemala and in Hispaniola, for example. But they don't have anywhere to go in Amazonia.
Okay, we should probably wrap it up.